Welcome to Infidelity Unfolded. Explore the hidden layers of relationships with us. Sometimes life presents us with surprises that are impossible to predict. Everything seems familiar and calm, and suddenly, in one moment, like a shift in the air, something changes. At first, it's imperceptible, on the edge of perception, but with every second, that feeling intensifies, growing inside until it becomes undeniable. That's exactly how I felt that evening, when Michael, my husband's father, came to visit us.
I am Emily, an ordinary woman living in a small town in Oregon.
I am married to James, and we have 2 children, to whom we have dedicated all our energy. Our house is situated right by the forest, and sometimes when I am alone, I feel as though the trees are whispering to each other, sharing ancient secrets. But, as I recently realized, the real mysteries are not hidden in the forest, but much closer, among those we consider to be our loved ones. Michael arrived, as he had informed us. His visits were rare but always welcome, given his busy work life in another state. That evening, I greeted him at the door, feeling a slight unease that was hard to explain. After dinner, we sat in the living room. James was talking about work, the children had already gone to bed, and only the fire in the fireplace witnessed our conversations. I tried not to look at Michael, but I felt his presence quietly filling the room. His gaze seemed to draw invisible lines between us, and despite the strangeness of the thought, I couldn't shake the sense of a subtle shift. I focused on James's words, but every time I lifted my eyes, I met Michael's glance. There was a calmness, yet also an intensity one couldn't quite define. Outside, the night deepened, and shadows stretched across the room. A quiet tension lingered, unspoken but present. That evening felt different, though I couldn't yet explain why. When the conversation slowed and James suggested we all retire for the night, I felt a strange sense of longing, not for anything specific, but for the curious connection that had filled the evening. I silently got up and followed my husband. The night was long. I turned in bed, sleep eluding me, my mind caught on fleeting thoughts of Michael, his calmness, his steady presence. I told myself it was just imagination, the echo of a thoughtful evening. The next morning, I acted as usual. Breakfast was normal, conversations easy, but I sensed Michael's quiet attention, as if he were reading my thoughts. When James left for work and the children went to school, I remained alone with Michael. The house stood still, the soft sway of trees outside brushing against the windows. I immersed myself in chores, yet found myself listening for quiet footsteps, familiar sounds. Michael entered the kitchen while I was washing dishes. His presence carried a calmness that both comforted and unsettled me. I didn't turn immediately, but I could feel him nearby. "Emily," he said softly, making me glance over my shoulder. His voice was even, but there was a quiet intensity behind it. He was closer than expected, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall into silence around us. His gaze held a quiet understanding, something deeper than mere conversation. We shared a moment of stillness, heavy with unsaid words. I struggled to find my voice, feeling the weight of something forming in the space between us, something unspoken, yet undeniable. Michael turned away first, giving me the chance to catch my breath. But deep down, I knew that moment would linger in my memory for a long time. I continued with my tasks, but every moment of that day felt touched by his presence, his quiet observations, his voice. It was like sensing a shift in the atmosphere, like a storm brewing far away, yet deeply. That day passed, leaving me with a feeling that something subtle but real had changed. I realized that the emotions stirring inside me were confusing, and yet, impossible to simply dismiss. Everything seemed so ordinary, yet within, a quiet force was growing, shaping my thoughts in ways I didn't fully understand. Throughout the day, I tried to focus on my responsibilities, cleaning, cooking, the usual routines, but my mind kept drifting back to Michael. I felt unsettled, but couldn't explain why. It was as if an invisible current surrounded me, pulling me inward with each passing moment. When evening came and James returned from work, I focused on maintaining normalcy. We had dinner together, exchanging words about daily life. James spoke about some work issues, and though I listened, I noticed my attention drifting toward Michael, who seemed equally aware of an unspoken distance forming between us. His quietness held an unfamiliar gravity, as if there were unspoken thoughts behind his calm gaze. After dinner, James suggested a walk. Feeling tired, I declined. He kissed me lightly on the forehead and left, leaving me and Michael alone in the house. The atmosphere grew heavier, like the moments before a rainfall. Michael broke the silence, his voice even, yet carrying a hint of concern. Emily, you've seemed different lately.
Is everything alright? The simple question caught me off guard.
I couldn't explain what I was feeling, even to myself. Yes, everything's fine, I replied, forcing a smile.
Juste a bit tired.
Michael said nothing more, but his thoughtful gaze lingered. It held questions I couldn't answer. The silence between us grew, but instead of being awkward, it felt charged with something unspoken. After a few minutes, the tension became too much for me. I rose from the sofa without meeting him. I'm going to get some fresh air, I said quietly, and stepped outside into the cool night. The world outside was still and calm.
The trees whispered softly in the night breeze.
I took a deep breath and walked down a familiar path toward the forest. I needed clarity, space to understand the thoughts swirling in my mind. This was Michael, someone who had always seemed distant and composed. Why then was I now feeling such deep confusion? I followed the path to a small pond, long forgotten. The water reflected the sparse stars above, motionless and silent.
He sat down on a bench by the shore, listening to the quiet rhythm of the night.
In that stillness, I felt my mind start to settle.
For a moment, he let everything go. Michael, James, the uncertainty.
But peace didn't last long. Footsteps approached from behind, and I tensed instinctively.
Turning, he saw Michael walking toward me.
He sat down beside me without a word.
His quiet présence tirait something within me. Something incertain, something unfamiliar.
We sat in silence, the night air around us thick with unsaid words. The space between us felt charged, though no words passed. It was as if some invisible thread linked us, unnoticed before. Inside me, emotions warred, a desire for distance and a reluctance to move away. Michael slowly turned to face me. In his eyes, I saw a reflection of the turmoil I felt myself, questions without answers. No words were spoken, and yet, something unspoken passed between us, undeniable, but still veiled in silence.
I felt my breathing grow shallow, my atras.
And I realized that the emotions I had tried to ignore were stronger than I wanted to admit. I knew that if I stayed here any longer, I wouldn't be able to resist anymore. But Michael, sensing my anxiety, broke the dark surface of the pond. I felt the tension between us begin to dissipate, but along with it came a quiet. I wanted him to make the first move, for the spark we both felt to awaken. But he might have understood that it was too dangerous. It's very peaceful here, he finally said, his voice calm and steady again, as if nothing had happened. Yes, I nodded, trying to regain control. It's a good place to think. He looked at me again, and I realized that this moment was just the beginning of something more. Despite everything I felt, despite all the uncertainty, I knew that this evening was only the first spark in a flame that would eventually grow stronger. We stayed there for a while longer until the night air began to chill us. Finally, I got up, and Michael did the same. We walked back to the house in silence, where our old lives awaited us. But I knew that this night had changed everything. When we returned, James was already asleep. I climbed into bed, feeling the cold night air from the forest still brushing against my skin. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come easily. I lay there, listening to James's quiet breathing, and thought about how everything would soon change. This night had marked the beginning of something new, something unpredictable, but I could not avoid it. My life would never be the same, and I could no longer stop what had begun. The next morning, I woke up with the feeling that the night in the forest was not a dream but a reality slowly taking hold of my heart. Everything around me seemed strangely familiar, but also changed. I couldn't shake thoughts of Michael, of how we had sat by the pond, surrounded by silence and hidden emotions. His image stayed with me, even as I tried to focus on daily chores. James had left for work early in the morning, and once again, I was alone in the house with Michael. The day began as usual. The kids went off to school. I took care of the cleaning, but everything around seemed painted in new, more vivid. In every step Michael took around the house, in every glance he cast, I sensed something I had never noticed before. It was like an invisible energy in the air that couldn't be ignored. All day, I tried to avoid encountering him. I felt that if we were alone again, what had happened by the pond might repeat itself, and I wouldn't be able to resist any longer. Yet, I still heard his footsteps in the neighboring rooms, and that feeling continued to surround me like a soft, inescapable mist. As evening approached, with the sun already setting, I heard his voice calling me from the living room. It was calm, as if nothing had changed, but I felt it was merely a mask hiding something deeper. I entered the room, trying to appear confident, but inside I was trembling.
Michael stood by the window, looking out at the golden evening sky.
I noticed him slightly turn his head towards me, catching the sound of my approaching steps. "Emily," he said quietly, as if testing my reaction to the sound of his voice. "Yes," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady, though it was becoming increasingly difficult. He didn't answer immediately, and I moved closer, unable to resist the invisible pull. The room was filled with silence, and only the faint wind outside reminded us that the world beyond our home continued to move. I found myself next to him, closer than I had intended, and felt the space between us thicken with unspoken words. Michael slowly turned to face me, and his eyes met mine. At that moment, I realized that I could no longer run away. A warmth was building between us that couldn't be denied. His gaze was so deep that I felt a shiver course through me. "Why are you avoiding me?" he asked softly, as if already knowing the answer, but wanting to hear it from me. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts, but they scattered like dry leaves. I couldn't lie to him, couldn't pretend that everything. "Because I'm afraid," I admitted, feeling my throat tighten. Michael nodded slowly, understanding what I meant without further explanation. He took a step toward me, and I felt his hand lightly brush against mine. The touch was feather-light, yet it stirred 1,000 emotions inside me. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and realized that I could no longer resist the feelings between us. Michael moved a little closer, and I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. At that moment, there was only a thin veil between us that could disappear any second. I didn't know how it would all end, but I knew one thing: I wanted it. I wanted him. He lifted his hand and gently tucked a stray lock of my hair behind my ear. The motion was so tender that I felt goosebumps rising along my skin. My heart pounded so loudly that I wondered if he could hear it. I could no longer hold back these feelings. They had enveloped me completely. Michael leaned slightly closer, and time seemed to pause. His gaze deepened with emotion, as if he, too, was caught in the moment. I knew I should step back, stop this, but I stood there, unable to move away. But instead, I took a step forward, feeling his hand gently resting on my cheek. And finally, his lips touched mine. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a release from everything that had held us back. The rules, the fears, the silence. His touch was soft and warm, and that moment stirred emotions I had never experienced before. Everything inside me whispered that this was dangerous, that I was standing at the edge of a choice I couldn't undo, but I couldn't pull away. Michael moved closer, and I felt the comfort of his arms, like they were holding me steady through a storm I had stepped into willingly. The moment deepened between us, filled with the kind of intensity we had kept buried for so long. I responded, overwhelmed by the weight of feelings I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I knew this could lead to consequences. I knew nothing would be the same again. But I couldn't stop thinking about how right it felt, despite everything. When we finally stepped back, both of us breathless, I couldn't believe what had just happened. My lips still tingled from the moment, and my heart was pounding in my chest. We looked at each other, unsure of what to say. "Emily," Michael whispered, his voice filled with hesitation I hadn't heard before. "We shouldn't." But I didn't let him finish. I knew he was right, but I wasn't ready to let go. I reached for him again, and our connection grew stronger, not just through a kiss, but through everything that had remained unsaid for so long. That moment was no longer something we could ignore. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. It wasn't about desire, it was about everything we had kept locked inside. Finally, as we stepped apart again, it felt like the world had shifted around us. I knew that nothing would be the same anymore. This moment had changed everything, a point of no return. I didn't know where it would lead, but I was certain of one thing: we could no longer pretend. Michael slowly let go, his eyes filled with emotion and uncertainty. The weight of the silence between us was heavier now, impossible to avoid. We both knew we'd made a choice, and now we had to face what came next. "We need to think," he said, and I nodded quietly, lost in thought. The silence around us felt louder than ever, and I stood there, realizing that everything had just shifted. What once was stable was now uncertain. Michael stepped back slightly, as if drawing a line we hadn't seen